In the first of this week's 2 new episodes of Steven Universe Future, Eyeball, Ruby, and Aquamarine return as the gem Bluebird. I'm not going to beat around the bush. I didn't like this episode very much. There were definitely things I liked in it, and I will talk about those things, but I'm mostly just going to whine about the things that I felt did not work in this episode, and it was honestly most of the things in this episode. First of all, brief synopsis. Eyeball and Aquamarine return as Bluebird, the little fusion gem that was clearly a fusion of the two of them that we saw in the opening sequence of the show when it was revealed early a while back. And to the credit of the supporting cast of Core Crystal Gems, all of them recognize who Bluebird actually is immediately. They don't actually know why Aquamarine and Ruby fused, but they know that it's Aquamarine and that one particular Ruby, both of whom didn't really like Steven very much. So when Steven assumes that showing up as a fusion was a way of them disguising themselves so they could get close and screw him over in some way, I honestly think he's being, I guess I would phrase it as appropriately pragmatic, though he does, I guess, jump the gun a little bit when he wants to just go after them immediately. And so I kind of understand why the others said that he should give them a chance, because again, they don't know why Eyeball and Aquamarine are here or why they fused. Maybe they have changed, maybe they can change. But they've been pulling pranks on Steven and Steven doesn't like it. And then they seem to be doing questionable stuff with all of Steven's family and friends. But at the same time, they're not hurting Steven's family and friends, and Steven's family and friends like them as Bluebird. And so it seems that they don't actually have any ill intention towards him or any of the people he cares about, but then just as it seems that that's the case, it turns out they do. And that this entire time, they didn't think anybody recognized who they were, and they hold Greg up by his hair and threaten to drop him off the house and kill him. And Eyeball even summons her little chisel knife thing and threatens to, I don't know, eviscerate him, I guess. It's not really made clear, but I imagine it would be violent. And they kind of give a pat, half-assed reason for why they're here and why they're doing this, but it really just boils down to they don't like Steven. And I guess that's my first problem with the episode, is I don't understand why these two characters. What about these two characters made them dislike Steven more than any of his other past enemies? What about them is special? Why are they the ones in this episode? Like, I get that the fandom has been excited to see them as this fusion in these episodes, or just this one episode, because I honestly don't know if they're going to show up again. But that's literally just because they were in that opening title sequence that was revealed early, implying that they had some more interesting, more special reason for being angry with Steven and coming here as this fusion as his enemy than anybody else would have. And they don't really have any more special reason for being angry with Steven than anybody else. Why isn't Holly Blue here? Why is it these two? I would argue that Jasper has more reason, at least from Jasper's point of view, to be still actively antagonizing Steven, and she's not even doing that. And I could get if it was just because the Diamond hierarchy's been upturned and Aquamarine doesn't like that, but why would a Ruby dislike that so much that she's still angry with Steven 2 years later, angry enough to come here with this Aquamarine as seemingly an equal player in this scheme? It just doesn't make sense. We are given no concrete reason why these two gems are special. It's just they were really annoyed with Steven. But, I mean, Peridot was really annoyed with Steven at first too, and now they're close friends. It doesn't feel natural to me. It feels like this episode was shoehorned in here so that they could subvert that trope where one character is paranoid and the other characters tell him not to be because he's being paranoid, and then they turn out to be right and he turns out to be wrong. Because Steven was definitely in the right here. But that brings me to specifically Bluebird, aka Aquamarine, and Eyeball's actions, because that's another minor problem I have with the episode. Bluebird isn't treated like her own character like other fusions. She's treated like a mask for these two other characters, and that kind of annoyed me, but that's more of a nitpick. Anyway, was Bluebird pulling pranks on Steven because she legitimately expected them to harm him? Like, I honestly thought the reveal was going to be that Aquamarine and Eyeball were here for sinister purposes, but the worst that they had in store for Steven was just to keep pranking him because they don't like him. Because honestly, pranking him, harming him in those small ways which raise suspicion about themselves, doesn't make sense based on how this episode was resolved. If they were legitimately intending to wait for the right moment and then attempt to harm him by harming the people he cares about, it doesn't make sense for them to raise suspicion, even in small ways, by pranking him. They were also there for what seemed like multiple days and nights, so why didn't they just come for Steven in his sleep at one point, if they didn't like him and wanted to actually genuinely harm him? Like, eventually they come for Greg. Like, maybe that was supposed to be the same night, the first night that they were actually there. Maybe I'm just missing that was the intention. But even then, it doesn't really make sense. Why go for Greg instead of Steven? Why not wait until Steven's actually asleep and then go for Steven? Were they trying to harm Steven specifically by harming Greg? Did they want to harm him specifically by harming the people he cares about? Was that scene earlier when they were coming up behind Pearl with a knife an actual genuine attempt to harm Pearl, but they just didn't go through with it because Steven spotted them before they could make Pearl into a hostage? What exactly was their plan? There's no consistency here. It doesn't make sense. Their motivations don't make sense. Their plan doesn't make sense. Maybe the episode was setting something up by introducing them in this new stage of their lives with access to this new fusion that they can make that has a pretty decent weapon and is pretty powerful, because Steven does fight them with his pink powers and they seem to be pretty evenly matched. But I really questioned whether or not this was the best way to set that up. If that was the intention, I would have much rather gotten that set up in an episode which better explained why these characters are so interested in still hurting him in the first place. What saves this episode and keeps me from calling it just like legitimately all around bad is the fact that there was some good comedy in here. Seeing Steven floundering to stop them from doing innocent fun activities with his friends and family was pretty funny, and seeing Alexandrite appear at the end to just straight up squash Bluebird's fusion was pretty funny. They're not exactly consistent, because I would have expected Steven to do better against them in his pink state if Alexandrite was able to beat them with a single hit, you know? And the moment when Greg takes charge and grabs Eyeball's chisel knife and uses it to free himself by cutting his hair was fantastic, because this is a very anime-inspired show, and cutting hair in anime or anime-inspired media is a way of visually representing a change in the character's demeanor or their mindset. And in part because of that, in part because of the way they animate it, it definitely feels like this is a turning point for Greg, that he has decided in that moment to be more proactive in protecting himself from these gem threats. And it's possible, I think, going forward that he may take a more active role in protecting the people he cares about from gem threats too. It's super cool. It was a very dynamic moment. I liked it a lot. I like Greg a lot, and he has been becoming more and more involved in events lately. But now it feels like that's going to be even more the case. It's a natural progression for his character, and it was handled very, very well. But the episode just had so many problems that, looking back on that moment and how great it was, I can't help but wish that that moment took place in an overall better episode. I feel like a lot of people are giving this episode more credit than it deserves because the humor was pretty good, and because that Greg moment was so solid. And also the action at the end was pretty solid too. And mentioning the action brings me back to the last thing, and the thing that I think is most frustrating about this episode. The last thing that I want to talk about is the fact that only one episode after drawing on his pink powers caused him to lash out and almost harm two people he cares about, Steven just goes back into his pink form without a second thought to use it against these two people who, despite being dangerous, there was no indication up to that point that it was necessary for him to go into his pink state to deal with them. I don't understand why he didn't even hesitate. I don't understand why he called upon that power again without ever addressing the fact that it has such harmful potential, such dangerous potential, and that there was no moment of revelation where he realized that he had drawn on that power again without any of those things coming to mind, causing him to take pause. It just doesn't make sense. It makes Steven seem like a far more irresponsible person than I feel he's supposed to come across as in this episode. Because as I said before, the point of this episode seems to be to suggest that Steven was the responsible one in this situation, that he was being responsible when he thought that Aquamarine and Eyeball might be here to harm him. So in an episode that's supposed to be subverting a trope where it's shown to be irresponsible to suspect people of such things, painting Steven as the more responsible and the more correct one, they make him seem so irresponsible at the end by having him draw on powers that he should be suspect of. It's just bad. It's a bad climax. It's a bad use of those powers in the climax. I didn't like it. It made me dislike this episode a lot more than I already had up to that point. I do hope we see Bluebird again, even though, like I said before, Bluebird doesn't feel like her own character. And what little snippets of her own character we got, I didn't really like as much as Aquamarine and Eyeball separate. But I do hope we see her again, just so the character can be used in a better story, hopefully. But otherwise, this episode's not great. There's just enough in it that I would never say that someone could skip this episode entirely. But I kind of wish there wasn't enough good stuff in here that I could tell you guys to just skip this episode entirely, because on subsequent re-watches of the series, I'm probably going to be skipping this episode entirely. That said, what did you guys think of the episode Bluebird, if you have seen it? And I'd really like to hear opposing opinions to mine. If you really like this episode, I'd really like to know why, because I honestly don't get it. Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below, or over on my Discord, link in the description. But either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.